I'm your host, Maureen Metcalf, and I'm delighted to be recording live from the International Leadership Association conference in Atlanta. I'm joined by Karen Longman. Karen is the Director of PhD Program in Higher Education at Azusa Pacific University. Karen, you've participated in creating a 4-book series of what will be an 8-book. You've published already 4 about women in leadership. Give us a little bit about your background and why women in leadership, of all of the topics.
Well, the first 4 books deal with 4 different aspects of this topic of women in leadership. And I think for me personally, and many of the people were at the International Leadership Association annual conference held in Atlanta, we're very concerned that there is a great deal of human capacity in women worldwide that's not being tapped or freed up or encouraged to be used. So for myself, I'm very much concerned that girls are growing up and women around the world have a lot to offer to resolve some of the world's big problems, and I think have very thoughtful ways of going about that kind of problem solving, but the culture in many parts of the world doesn't support that women could use their gifts or could advance into leadership to make a difference in terms of the areas they're passionate about.
And so the first step, or one of the many steps for you, is participating and leading this book series. To what extent are these issues global issues?
The first book in the series is primarily North American, and it's called Women in Leadership in Higher Education. The fact is, within North America, which is the focus of that particular book, the majority of people getting degrees, whether it's an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or doctorate, the majority are women now. But in higher education nationally, in the United States at least, we still only have about 26% women presidents. And most of those are in the community college system or are in women's colleges or smaller, struggling liberal arts institutions. But the other 3 books are really international in scope. The second one's called Women and Global Leaders, and the third one's called Women in Leadership Around the World. And the foreword to one of those books makes the point that a lot of leadership research and literature has been Western, but there's a scholar at Harvard University who spoke this morning and was very emphatic that leadership is always done in a context and always done with what she calls followers, and we must be attentive to the context of the leadership. So to presume that what might advance women into, say, corporate leadership or higher education leadership might be completely different in other parts of the world. So there's a great deal of research being done, and that has been done. But taking what has been learned about what contributes to effective leadership or how diversity at the top of organizations and corporations helps with profitability and retention and organizational culture, that hasn't always been translated into practices that help organizations and corporations be strategic about how to encourage really bright, up-and-coming leaders, whether they be male or female, get their feet underneath themselves and be ready to provide leadership at steadily increasing levels.
And I think the statistics are still true that women tend to attrit faster than men do as we go through our careers.
Women tend to
hit a glass ceiling or leave for various reasons, and or don't get promoted to those C-level and board positions in the same percentage as men do.
Yeah, there's a wide variety of external factors. There are microaggressions. There are implicit biases. There's probably 20 to 50 different reasons why that reality is still the case, even in a first world country like the United States.
Are there something like a top 3? Are there some major reasons you can point to of those 20?
I would say the literature now is really interesting in that it's looking not just at the external reasons. For example, women tend to have fewer mentors, fewer sponsors. Women tend to get lower paid positions. Women tend to take on a great deal of work because they sense a responsibility for the organization, whereas men tend to get promoted and let people below them do the busy work. But the more interesting literature right now is really on the internal dynamics of women often wanting their lives to make a difference and wanting to be invested in something that has a purpose or a cause that they believe in, but not really necessarily being interested in positional leadership or not being interested in high status leadership. These are obviously sweeping judgments.
Right.
There's a scholar out of Northwestern University in Chicago who's done what we call a meta-analysis of a lot of the research, Dr. Alice Igley at Northwestern. And she would say the top of the bell curves for how women lead and how men lead are somewhat different. There is a difference in the way women view the world and the way men view the world. But what motivates women to get into leadership was different than, again, big generalizations, but men tend to be more hierarchical and more interested in status, more interested in power, and more competitive. And women tend not to align their lives around those things. They're more interested in purpose and the mission of the organization and making the world a better place, or creating a fabric in the organization that people love working in. And those things tend not to be what causes people to rise to the very top of those positions.
Okay, so this is fascinating to me because I'm starting to pursue a board role, really trying to understand. There's a lot of push for women in board positions, but I really wanted to understand what is the value proposition truly, quantifiably. Why does my gender better qualify me? Is that something you can explain, especially to some of my male colleagues who might say, "Why care?"
I would say it does not better position you. I would say the research, and it's very wide, well-respected research, and the source for boards in particular would be Catalyst out of New York City. They are a nonprofit, catalyst.org, which has done a great deal of work on corporate leadership and on board leadership. And Susan has actually done a summary of some research on several different reasons why diversity in leadership makes a difference, why diversity on board leadership makes a difference. Part of which is the profitability of companies, part of which is the organizational culture that people work in, part of which is the more perspectives you have on a problem, the smarter the decisions are.
And that was the one that resonated with me, that it isn't about my gender. It's about the experiences I've had differently because I've traveled through my life in a different body and socialized differently. So I bring a different view.
Yeah, so same for racial ethnic diversity, gender diversity, age diversity, getting different voices and different life experiences and different priorities and different perspectives around the board table or around the executive leadership table is in many ways very beneficial for organizations and companies. And that's well documented. If you just go to catalyst.org, they're documenting all the research that contributes to that kind of summative statement.
For women who are thinking about this and having to answer the question, and for men who are saying, I hear that it's a good thing to do this, but I don't get why. That was why I wanted to ask the question so that the conversation might actually change someone's behavior.
Yeah, I think it's important that we look at the research, and there is a great deal of research, and many studies are showing that the greater diversity at the top, in multiple ways, organizations benefit.
So, what are some other causes for women not to progress?
Yeah, that's the internal motivators or the
Okay.
internal hindrances. And I think in general, often women value things that are not materialistic or not power oriented or not prestige oriented. So, what tends to motivate women or what women tend to value, I think, is somewhat different. And again, the top of the two bell curve, there seems to be some difference that men, even the way they play sports, boys are more competitive and more individualistic. So, as someone has said, boys grow up, dreaming about being the quarterback who single-handedly can throw the Hail Mary pass and the football team wins when he gets on the adulation. Girls grow up wanting to be cheerleaders. So they're basically on the sidelines supporting somebody else and looking good.
And even if we don't want those roles, we don't have much choice.
Well, I think culture definitely shapes what we become. So women tend to find a lot of value in creating cultures or organizational environments that people thrive in and feel valued and want to work and are part of something significant. So there's a book actually called The Web of Leadership, Sally Helgeson, which talks about how women tend to bring people along and create an idea that a group can accomplish. But sometimes in a male normed organization, that's not viewed as leadership because the woman is not putting her hand up saying, I'm leading it, it's my vision, I'm making it happen, which is the way a male normed culture views leadership. Sometimes what women value and what women are willing to invest their lives in is not positional power or is not status, because we tend not to draw our attention to ourselves. We tend to decentralize attention and be sure that collectively a group is owning it and making something important happen.
So it makes sense, and it sounds like it's largely based on how we're socialized and where we feel most comfortable. And yet I have coached people where the entering complaint was they don't seem leaderly. And that sense of leaderly was They don't stand up and take charge. They're more collaborative.
It's tricky because even reading in the newspaper, coming here to Atlanta, the headlines were the role that women will be playing in the U.S. election. And the point was made that every president in U.S. history has been a male. So you can say that someone does not look presidential. But the fact is, if you don't look like a male, then you don't look like a leader. And that's been part of the accusations against some of the female candidates, even in the election here.
Certainly, there are other countries that already have female presidents. So there are others who, if that would be the measure, are doing better. There are others that are doing much worse.
It is very important to be attentive to the context that people are leading in. So obviously, if you read a book like Half the Sky, the conditions that many millions, maybe billions of women are living in are appalling in terms of lack of education, lack of health care, lack of basic human needs like Maslow's hierarchy. And actually, there are not very many women leaders in terms of the political scene around the world. What seems to make the biggest difference is countries in Europe, and Norway would be one example, in Scandinavia, where the government has mandated a certain percentage of women on boards. And the countries that are advancing the fastest seem to be the institution in terms of fully using women's gifts. If there's national legislation that says corporations of a certain size must have a certain percentage of women on the boards, Norway has been a leader in the world on that. That seems to be making the biggest difference in terms of changing corporate culture, organizational culture.
So in some ways, the legislation really supports the social progress.
Equally, legislation that is supportive of a workplace climate or childcare legislation, so that when women do have children, the laws equalize the availability of both spouses to take care of both parents taking care of the child. So definitely public policy can play a role and should be playing a role in trying to create countries where human potential and human capacity is freed up. The world loses when you've got gifted women. Half your population are living in environments that either may be completely repressive or marginalizing women's gifts, or at least not fully embracing and welcoming them.
If I'm a young woman and I want to progress, and if I'm a business owner that wants to support women, and I'm also financially constrained, what might I do that wouldn't be expensive, but would be high impact?
If I were a young woman thinking about this, I think the more this would be impossible for people to do, but the more people know the literature and the fact that women tend to bring a more transformational and inclusive and empowering leadership style where the company and the employees feel better about what they're doing with their lives and fully investing themselves. This is very true for the millennial generation too. They want to be invested in a cause that they believe in and where they're taken seriously, and they make something happen. So the research would say that what women bring to leadership is exceedingly important. And I think that women need to have confidence that what they bring can have value, even if it's out of sync with a male-normed culture. And you may feel marginalized, but to know that what you offer can make a difference in your company and that diversity of voices is important. If I owned a company and had limited resources, one of the fun parts of life is you meet people with huge potential. You never know when you sit next to somebody on an airplane what that person has to offer. And to hire bright, up-and-coming talent and then put wind under their wings is incredibly exciting. So to get out of our stereotypes, there's a huge movement around strengths-based leadership now to try to identify where are people good in any number of ways, whether it's the Gallup-Clifton Strengths Questionnaire or other instruments, and affirm giftedness and put people into places to use their gift mix to contribute to a cause or a company. There's just huge capacity in the next generation of up-and-comers that we need to figure out how to deploy that.
So it sounds like underlying that is understanding that a person in a female body has a different perspective, and how we've defined leadership in a traditionally male society is limited and limiting for our business success. And by expanding that, business owners will be better off and women will have the opportunities.
Yeah, I think we also need a different definition of leadership. Leadership is the ability to mobilize people to get work done, or the ability to make a difference by influencing other people. And when we only think of positional and hierarchical leadership in male-normed ways, and women don't buy that package or don't want that package, we risk losing the potential and the capacity that they would bring. So there's a shorthand expression, because some leaders are born women. We tend to think there is actually a leadership theory called think manager, think male. that we tend to think of leaders as being male. I think we need to think outside of those boxes and begin to think about giftedness and talent and a huge body of literature now on calling. What do people feel called to do in their lives? What do they feel burdened to make a difference? Whether it's relieving a country of poverty or working in healthcare. And how do you free up the capacity of people that want to make a difference in that sphere of influence? So I think we need to think about leadership with a different, broader definition of being able to get good work done.
Even though I define it the same way you do, I realize in listening and coming up through an environment that was very male dominated, I had some biases because of how I grew up. That even as a female who wants women to succeed and has been quite active, I've succeeded by adopting male behavior. And I personally need to change how I'm thinking about it. And if I need to change it as a female activist, certainly men who it's just not their issue need to refine how they're thinking about leadership and our implicit biases. Thank you so much, Karen. I'm delighted that you joined us.
Thank you.